My name is Dale Martin. I teach in the Religious Studies Department, and I'm serving this year as the acting chair of the Terry Lectures Committee. And I have the pleasure of introducing our Terry Lectures for this year, our series of lectures this semester, as well as our speaker for the first time. While I'm at it, everybody turn these off. Just a reminder. Philip Kitcher is the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Columbia University. This was not planned, but it is certainly a happy coincidence that Kitcher, as the John Dewey Professor, is giving the Terry Lectures 80 years after Dewey did so. 1933, John Dewey gave the Terry Lectures here at Yale, and in 1934, the lectures were published by Yale University Press as A Common Faith. Dewey's Terry Lectures advocated a scientifically informed sort of theism, shorn of what he called supernatural elements. Dewey was, though, a Unitarian, and his view of religion and ethics was sometimes called religious humanism. It has been said, I'm not sure I agree with this, but it has been claimed that with the death of John Dewey in 1952, religious humanism also died, to be then replaced by secular humanism. So that it's perfect that now, 80 years after Dewey's lectures, we have an advocate of secular humanism as our Terry lecturer. Philip Kitcher was born in London, raised on the south coast of England, educated at Cambridge, and then at Princeton, where Thomas Kuhn was one of his teachers. He early on studied the philosophy of mathematics and later philosophy of biology and the sciences more generally. In 1982, he published Abusing Science, The Case Against Creationism, and his work has continually circled back to the relationship between science and religion. One of his well-known works is his 2009 book, Living with Darwin, Evolution, Design, and the Future of Faith. In his most recently published book, The Ethical Project, published in 2011, from which we may hear reverberations in his lecture on Thursday, which is entitled Ethics as a Human Project. In that book, Kitcher proposes that we think of ethical values not as deriving from divine revelation, nor as the discoveries of human geniuses, but as having evolved over many years as human beings attempted to discern better ways of living with one another. Ethics as empirical, one might say. He has published, at my last count, 12 books, and seemingly countless articles and essays. Kitcher was the first person to be awarded the Prometheus Prize from the American Philosophical Association in 2006. His Terry Lectures address several issues related to secular humanism. In lectures this coming Thursday and Tuesday and Thursday of next week, he will speak on ethics as a human project, mortality and meaning, and depth and depravity. His lecture for today is titled Beyond Doubt. Please help me welcome Philip Kitcher to Yale.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that splendid introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and a great honor, especially since Dewey is not only the man for whom my chair is named, but also one of my intellectual heroes. And you may hear some resonances of Dewey's original Terry Lectures in what I'm going to say. So, let me begin. Secular humanism begins in doubt, but doubt should be only the beginning. For anyone who has once lived under the sway of religion, the rejection of religious commitment leaves a vacuum demanding to be filled. The fully secular life cries out for orientation. It isn't achieved by bare denial, however strident or caustic the denial may be. We live in a time when the most prominent forms of atheism seem content to conclude their onslaught on religious doctrines by singing hymns to the glories of scientific understanding. And I think it's easy today to sympathize with William James's pithy characterization of the fervent atheist. He believes in no God and worships him. If it's to be lived, and to be understood as a fully rewarding way for us to live, secular humanism requires positive elaboration. A purely negative critique arouses reactive doubt to the effect that secularists have ignored pervasive aspects of people's lives, that the human has entirely disappeared from view. Clusters of comfortable intellectuals may be satisfied by secular humanism, but people not primarily focused on the search for knowledge, or people more exposed to the vicissitudes of the world, will want substitutes for the guiding ideas that they've had to give up. My main aim in these lectures is to explore one possible way of articulating a secular humanism. And I'm going to try to answer the complaint that it entails important losses. I'm going to try to show that secular humanism can provide a satisfying account of values, that it finds room for the meaning of human lives, that it can answer major challenges posed by the fact of our mortality, and that it neither condemns us to a shallow form of existence nor overlooks the darkness of human nature. Yet, although my primary purpose is the construction of a positive perspective, today I want to start with the reasons for secularist skepticism. Secular humanism begins, after all, with doubt. What kinds of doubt? About religion, of course. But to say that only provokes a further question. What exactly is religion, or what counts as a religion? A popular but incautious answer identifies religions with bodies of doctrine about the existence and characteristics of special kinds of beings, deities, who deserve our worship and service because of their impressive attributes. One straightforward reason for refining that answer is that not all the many religious practices of human beings are centered on deities. Some focus on spirits or ancestors or even on impersonal forces with which it's important for people to align themselves. More importantly, though, doctrines, things to be believed by the devout, aren't central to all forms of religion. For the moment, I'm going to set that concern aside and consider an obvious refinement of the incautious proposal. Religions invoke something beyond the mundane physical world, some transcendent realm, to invoke a term that's as vague as it is useful and popular. And they offer doctrines about this transcendent. So all around the world, religious people avow doctrinal statements. They declare that God made a covenant with Abraham, or that the prophet was visited by an angel who commanded him to recite the divine message, or that Jesus rose from the dead. Part, but only part, of secular humanist doubt consists in the denial that any of these statements, or any of their counterparts in other religions, is true. Now, you can't understand that denial, nor appreciate its grounds, unless you first think about what the statements are supposed to mean. A familiar distinction separates literal construals of religious claims, usually found in particular scriptures, from alternative interpretations that are metaphorical, or allegorical, or poetic. That division, however, is only a crude way of marking the ends of a continuum. At one pole are readings supposing that an ancient Mesopotamian pastoralist was once visited by an imposing old man with a long white beard in the style of Blake, or that a Meccan estate manager had repeated encounters in the desert with a large gleaming figure outfitted with impressive wings, or that the son of a carpenter from Nazareth was completely dead and later alive again, where the criteria for life and death are those laid down by medical practice. Now, perhaps there are Jews and Muslims and Christians who subscribe to precisely those interpretations, just as there are some people who think the world was created in 6 periods of exactly 24 hours, with all major kinds of plants and animals found at the very beginning. But I think most people who profess these faiths probably don't intend anything so detailed and specific. They allow that ordinary descriptions fall short, that their doctrines contain mysteries. Many religions, including the three Abrahamic versions of monotheism, supply a rich body of statements for the faithful to interpret. Idealizing, we might assign each religious believer what I'll call a doctrinal profile, fixed by the level of detail and specificity with which she reads each of the doctrinal statements. Sometimes she may import all the everyday implications of the words used. Jesus wept is construed as claiming that a particular historical figure shed tears on a particular occasion. In other instances, she may retreat from the commonplace allusions and implications. Muhammad, in the Meccan desert, had an extraordinary experience in which he conceived an outside source as inspiring him to repeat certain words. No angel, no great figure with impressive wings. Extreme literalists are those who insist that all the doctrinal statements associated with their religion be read with the maximal amount of specificity. For them, the warfare between science and religion is typically intense. For many others, however, the idea of any single doctrinal profile is an idealization. When pressed, people feel unsure exactly how much of the everyday implications they want to import into their creedal professions. Confessing to doctrinal indefiniteness, they resist producing clear and unambiguous translations of statements that play a central role in their lives. To unsympathetic outsiders, this kind of doctrinal indefiniteness, or even the milder practice of retreating from the everyday implications of the language used in formulating religious claims, can appear evasive. Critics who detect a contradiction within the body of religious doctrine, or between articles of doctrine and well-confirmed results of inquiry, are informed that the apparent inconsistency is the product of simplistic reading, or worse, that the exact content of the doctrine resists specification. Insistence on providing definite content for doctrinal statements ignores the long history of subtle interpretive strategies for reading the scriptures, as well as the more obvious point that the main religious texts weren't written by people intending to submit articles to scientific journals. Flexibility of interpretation is nonetheless easily abused. It allows retreat in response to criticism and a compensatory advance later in exhortations to an audience of the faithful. How then, in such murky waters, can secular humanism follow any clear current? By permitting many questions to go unanswered, but demanding an answer to one. The core of secularist doubt is skepticism about anything transcendent. Believers may retreat from committing themselves to all-powerful creators with long white beards, or gleaming figures with impressive wings, or to the living physical presence of someone who was previously fully medically dead. But so long as they interpret their doctrines as recording episodes that were connected with something beyond the physical, organic, human world, secular humanism doubts the truth of what is claimed. Only when the believer can forthrightly declare that the resurrection is a metaphor to convey an important ideal, saying perhaps that when the man we know as Jesus died permanently, there was no abrogation of normal physical and organic processes, but that his acceptance of injustice and agonizing punishment reveals the wonderful human possibility of self-sacrifice. Only then will secularists conclude that nothing is left to provoke resistance. Strategies of interpretation may vary. Doctrines may be allowed to be indefinite, but one question must be addressed. Does this doctrine presuppose some claim about something transcendent? So far, all I've tried to do is identify the nature of secular humanist doubt. I'm now going to turn to the grounds for skepticism. Many religions that once pervaded human societies have surely vanished without trace. But even when attention is focused on those that have survived, And from the historical record, we find an astounding variety in religious doctrines: impersonal forces, sacred places, ancestors, ghosts, spirits, demons, and a wide diversity of deities have all figured as supposed manifestations of the transcendent. Sometimes religious cultures are aware of part of the variety, allowing tolerantly that the divinities of the neighbors are, although inferior, fully real. Sometimes they're more aggressive. Ours is the true religion, all the rest is primitive superstition. Assuming for the moment that the doctrines are understood with relative specificity, so that distinct religions give very different characterizations of the transcendent, an obvious question arises: how is it possible to make sense of this diversity of religious doctrine? Even when religions make no explicit claim to being exclusive, it strains credulity to admit all the rival claims as true. Nobody thinks the world is so full of mystic forces, sacred places, spirits, and divinities that the entire population of claimants can be accommodated. So long, then, as the interpretation of religious doctrine is sufficiently specific, literal enough to assert the existence of personal and impersonal beings, a distinction has to be drawn between those religions that have an approximately accurate inventory and those that are utterly mistaken. Yet the bases of belief are remarkably similar across the entire array of religious traditions, including those condescendingly characterized as primitive superstitions. Leaving what are taken to be religious experiences on one side for the moment, the religious convictions of many contemporary believers are formed in very much the same ways. Often the faithful are born into a religious tradition whose law they absorb in early childhood and continue to accept throughout their lives. Sometimes, when the surrounding society contains adherents of a different doctrine, acquaintance with that religion prompts conversion and a shift of allegiance. In either case, however, religious believers rely on a tradition. They take that tradition to have carefully preserved insights once vouchsafed to privileged witnesses in a remote past. Because that pattern is so prevalent in grounding the religious beliefs of the present, it's very hard to declare that one of the traditions has a special status, or even that a manageable few have transmitted truth about the transcendent. The beliefs of each tradition stand on much the same footing. Complete symmetry prevails. How can a devout person, deeply convinced of some specific substantive doctrine, say the claim that the world is the creation of a single personal deity, come to terms with this predicament? To face it clearly is to recognize that if, by some accident of early childhood, he'd been transported to some distant culture, brought up among Aboriginal Australians, say, he would now affirm a radically different set of doctrines, perhaps about the reverberations of the dreamtime in the present. And he'd do so with the same deep conviction and as a result of the same type of processes that characterize his actual beliefs. Insisting that his reading of the favored scriptures is accompanied by some special feeling, a sensu divinitatis, is fruitless, a fig leaf covering for dogmatism. His Australian counterpart would avow similar feelings, aroused by listening to narratives about the sacred places, although he wouldn't decorate his own professions with a Latin tag. Defenders of specific religious doctrines can at this point rightly object that the deck has been stacked against them through the deliberate neglect of an important part of the basis for belief, to wit, the religious experiences believers sometimes have. Uncontroversially, throughout history, people have reported episodes in which they've taken themselves to gain access to the transcendent, although how frequently such episodes occur is hard to assess, since the available statistics show wild variation in different years. Religious experiences occur in all cultures and are invariably described using the categories either of a religion to which the subject already adheres or of a religion with which she's familiar. once again, symmetry prevails. Moreover, cultures are typically sensitive to the possibility that those who report religious experiences have been deceived, even that they've been seduced into wickedness, and they introduce special procedures for validating claims to encounter the transcendent, requiring that the messages allegedly delivered conform to the orthodoxy handed down across the generations, as, for example, in the medieval certification of anchorites. Instead of serving as an independent source of justification for religious doctrine, religious experience is thus parasitic on the deliverances of tradition. Not all of the full array of specific doctrines about the transcendent can be accepted as true. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of them must be regarded as thoroughly false. Nevertheless, the processes through which those doctrines have come to be adopted are all of the same general type, and there's no basis for distinguishing the wheat from the chaff. Under these circumstances, secular humanists conclude that we should deny all of them. That conclusion is reinforced by 2 centuries of careful investigation of religious traditions and their evolution. Scholars have traced the ways in which the scriptural canon has been assembled, showing how incompatible conceptions of what are supposedly the same transcendent phenomena and of the same historical events have been fused, presumably in an effort to incorporate distinctive ideas favored by different groups so that they can share a religious perspective. Scholars have demonstrated the ways in which doctrine has been shifted to respond to the felt needs or aspirations of potential converts, and how it's adapted to the political pressures of the moment. Mark's a contorted account of the role of the Jews in demanding that Jesus be subjected to a Roman punishment is a case in point. A fiction that has caused extraordinary harm, but that surely eased the passage of early Christianity in a Rome-dominated world. Sociologists have studied how contemporary religions accommodate the psychological needs of those they hope to recruit, and how the accommodations modify the orthodox interpretations of religious claims and the emphasis placed on particular texts. The mega-churches of the wealthy suburbs don't usually urge the centrality to Christianity of the Sermon on the Mount. Although the psychological study of religious experience is handicapped by recent sensitivities about the legitimacy of controlled experiments, it's no longer considered acceptable to administer psychotropic drugs to unwitting subjects in the hope of identifying an increased frequency in reports of encounters with the transcendent. The available evidence amply supports the conclusion that religious experiences are more likely to happen to people who are psychologically disturbed or who are under the influence of substances typically viewed as interfering with clear and reliable perception. The moral of all this is that the roots to contemporary acceptance of religious doctrines are not merely of the same generic type across societies and cultures, but the historical genesis of belief is pervaded, if not entirely dominated, by processes of kinds quite unlikely to yield correct beliefs. Shaping ideas about the transcendent to evade political pressures or to accommodate the wishes of hoped-for converts isn't a reliable means of generating true doctrines or even of better approximating the truth. Simply absorbing the reports of a religious experience provided by all and sundry would infect doctrine with all manner of delusions, which is why successful traditions have insisted on conformity to orthodoxy, and why many subjects of religious experience, the prophet prominent among them, have worried about the genuineness of their voices and their visions. Most specific religious doctrines must be false, and since all emerge from the same generic style of historic development, it follows that generating belief in that way isn't reliable. 2 centuries worth of studies, literary, historical, sociological, political, and anthropological, add an explanation of the unreliability. By doing so, they deepen the secular humanist case for doubt. Now, what I've said faces obvious rejoinders, and it needs qualification. The first, and most natural perhaps, is the accusation of distorting the religious perspective by emphasizing knowledge and ignoring faith. What exactly has been shown, a critic might ask? Merely that specific religious doctrines are not held as items of knowledge, or perhaps more precisely, not held as the kind of knowledge that requires reliable ways of generating and sustaining belief. Thoughtful religious people should have been ready to concede as much from the beginning. They should have insisted that religious doctrines are held on the basis of faith, and if it's apt to see them also as knowledge, it's knowledge of a distinctive sort. That's the critic. Yet the ground on which he invites us to tread is slippery. We should go slowly. First, is there religious knowledge? Apparently it's claimed by some prominent religious traditions. In one of Handel's settings, the soprano sings gloriously of her knowledge of the living Redeemer. If that knowledge is of some special type, an explanation is needed to show the kinship with the everyday conception. Otherwise, talk of knowledge would just be a misleading pun. More importantly, the notion of faith is many-sided. Faith can be constituted by trust in a person or in some manifestation of the transcendent. It could consist in commitment to an ideal or to living in a particular way. If, however, the issue concerns the acceptance of specific religious doctrines, the most straightforward sense involves a contrast with belief on the basis of evidence. In the uncharitable quip, faith is when you believe and you know it ain't so. On a slightly more sympathetic reading, faith is belief that outruns the evidence available to the believer. According to some religious people, even if religious doctrines are held without compelling evidence, such belief is legitimate. What standard of legitimacy is at issue here? Not an epistemic one. We aren't dealing with reasonableness in Hume's sense when he declares that reasonable people proportion their beliefs to the evidence. To confute religious faith by declaring that legitimate beliefs are simply defined as those based on the available evidence would be silly, a glorious victory only for Humpty Dumpty. Fans of faith hope to offer a different view. They hope to set human practices of forming belief within a broader context, one in which many different types of values come into play. And they regard a leap beyond the evidence as permissible in light of the entire spectrum of those values, or at least of the most important ones. And so the legitimacy at stake is ethical. William James's delicious enfant terrible, W.K. Clifford, denied any such legitimacy. He argued that it is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on the basis of insufficient evidence. And he thereby provoked James to write what is probably the most influential article ever written by any American philosopher. Clifford defended his sweeping generalization by considering scenarios in which believing beyond the evidence leads to actions causing great harm, or the risk of such harm. The heart of James's reply identifies different possibilities, cases in which abstaining from belief would forfeit valuable consequences for the believer, and in which the impact on the welfare of others can be assumed to be negligible. The solitary mountaineer wills himself into believing that a difficult leap will succeed. The suitor who courts his beloved with unwarranted confidence increases his personal chances of success. Neither inflicts damage on anyone else. Secularists can concede the validity of these examples and yet deny the ethical permissibility of holding religious doctrines by a leap of faith. Precisely because religious commitments typically pervade the lives of the devout, they aren't insulated from actions with serious consequences for others. To believe in earnest is typically a spur to doing something else, to proselytizing, even to coercion, punishment, and campaigns to eradicate the party of evil. Only if the tie between belief and action were completely cut, or if it were firmly subordinated to ethical values, could the adoption of specific doctrine on the basis of faith be legitimate. In the first case, what the believer declares in her heart would never be expressed in her conduct, leaving a faith so attenuated as to be scarcely worthy of the name. In the second, which is the important one, I think, the primarily religious commitment is to orient life by recognizing important values, and belief in doctrine figures only as a means to ethical ends. Faith becomes ethically legitimate because it's focused from the beginning on the ethical. Viewing faith as a commitment to the most fundamental ethical ideals is the most direct way of responding to Clifford's critique. But it's quite at odds with one of the most celebrated ideas about faith, Kierkegaard's provocative attempt to justify religious faith. Abraham, the knight of faith, is prepared to sacrifice his son, Isaac, to fulfill a divine command. He's fully aware of his ethical obligation to protect the boy. He loves Isaac deeply, and he recognizes that the sacrifice will nullify God's promise to him that his descendants will cover the earth. Not only does he believe on insufficient evidence, but he does so knowing that the combination of his convictions is paradoxical. He believes in virtue of the absurd. While admitting that he doesn't understand Abraham, Kierkegaard admires him precisely because of his willingness to suspend the ethical and to honor the absolute duty to God. Now, if you're tempted to discern some overriding value in Abraham's devotion to the deity, then you should reflect on the fact that what he's prepared to do would deprive his son of any similar opportunity to do the same thing. The nobility of being the knight of faith is purchased by denying that opportunity to Isaac. Abraham stands at the end of a continuum of those who are ready to do profoundly inhumane things in the name of religious faith, a continuum whose other, milder pole is occupied by the irresponsible believers who so troubled Clifford. Giving a general license to commitments to religious doctrines that outrun the evidence allows the members of this diverse array of human cultures and societies to act on the basis of whatever interpretation they give to whatever sayings or texts they choose, to permit their inspiration to be Mein Kampf or the 120 Days of Sodom. And that's to tolerate fanaticism in any or all of its guises. Unless the application of doctrine is always subordinated to a commitment to ethical values, unless there's no suspension of the ethical, the invocation of faith can't legitimize acceptance of religious doctrine. So, secular humanism denies specific doctrines about the transcendent. The conflicts among them and the unreliability of the processes that have generated them make it virtually certain that they're one and all false. Nor can adherence to such doctrines be condoned by supposing that believers exercise an ethically permissible expression of faith. Yet secularists needn't categorically deny the existence of the transcendent. They ought to be mindful of the history of inquiries into the natural world. Scientists have often been confident that major features of nature have been finally determined, only to learn that radical revision is in order. On the basis of what we now take ourselves to know, there's good evidence for skepticism, not only about all extant specific doctrines about the transcendent, but about the reality of the transcendent in any form. Nor does that assessment change under the broader purview if we imagine rigorous applications of currently approved methods for justifying belief. From where we now stand, acceptance of anything transcendent is a wild leap. Belief is surely speculative conjecture. Nevertheless, the history of human knowledge has been marked by recurrent surprises. The world has often turned out to be richer and stranger than had previously been suspected. Secularists can't rule out the possibility that someday the future march of rigorous inquiry will disclose an aspect of reality apparently dimly prefigured in some religious doctrines, inspiring the retrospective judgment, so that's what the world's religions were trying to gesture at all along. Attempts to envisage the details of the discovery defeat the imagination. it's hardly unreasonable to attribute low probability to the scenario. Yet the bare possibility should be admitted. History suggests that when ancient ideas are resurrected, the anticipations are retrospectively recognized as vague and embryonic. By analogy, if some notion of a transcendent realm is rehabilitated, we can expect it to exceed the conceptual grasp of its earlier champions. Barring extraordinary luck, specific religious doctrines will be revealed as thoroughly erroneous, and indeed as framed in entirely inadequate language. Even if the day of discovery dawns, it's overwhelmingly unlikely to vindicate the dream time, or the transmigration of souls, the Hindu pantheon, or the Trinity, even the bare thought of a divine creator or of a mind behind the universe. All the categories religions have deployed are almost certainly inadequate to their intended task. Pursuit of doubt leads secular humanism to a position rarely made explicit: agnosto-atheism, to give it an unattractive name. The agnostic part of the view consists in allowing that while there is no basis for endorsing the transcendent, the bare possibility of some future justified acceptance of it can't be eliminated. With respect to the substantive doctrines of the world's religions, agnosto-atheists are less accommodating. There are excellent grounds for supposing all such doctrines to be thoroughly false. So much I take to be beyond doubt. Now to be more conciliatory. The most prominent contemporary critiques of religion prompt many believers to reply that they don't touch the real faith, the form of devotion espoused by the most thoughtful and sensitive adherents. Critics are accused of oversimplifying, of substituting crude caricatures for complex commitments, of assimilating all religion to fundamentalism. The accusations have some merit, in that prominent contemporary forms of atheism presuppose that religious doctrines must be read with considerable specificity. Yet to dismiss atheist critiques as substituting caricatures for finely shaded portraits overlooks an obvious fact. However subtle the religious conceptions of those who inhabit divinity schools or faculties of religion, of those who write books or book reviews about religious questions, many believers would acquiesce in the interpretive approaches assumed by the critics. The devout often read religious doctrines just as the atheists do. Indeed, the fastest growing religions in many parts of the world are those insisting on substantive doctrines, construed with considerable specificity, literalist religions. The real faith may be untouched by contemporary broadsides. It may have been articulated and defended for centuries by the most intelligent and subtle religious thinkers, but it's hardly the form of religion that is most vital and sometimes most violent in the modern world. My skeptical argument, too, doesn't target all forms of religion. It's been marked by places where I've made assumptions, places where alternative conceptions of religion might be developed, assuming, first, that religions are centered on doctrines, second, that doctrines are read by importing the specific implications of the words used to formulate them, and third, that faith is not primarily viewed as a commitment to ethical values and ideals. My secularist argument generates its agnosto-atheist conclusion. But when you suspend those assumptions, it's possible to recognize an alternative conception of religion and alternative versions of major world religions that evade the reasoning. Moreover, this rival conception allows an elaboration of religious challenges to secular humanism. It thus enables important issues to be joined. To identify this alternative perspective, I'm going to begin from a possibility I glossed over in presenting the secularist argument. Sometimes a challenge to select from an array of conflicting options can be met by seeking an approach that restricts itself to their shared features. The symmetry that prevails across religious doctrines might be accommodated by affirming a common core. Instead of making an arbitrary and dogmatic assertion that the substantive doctrines of some specific tradition are correct, the religious believer contends that all the world's religions share an insight, their least common denominator. When the focus is on religions as bodies of doctrine, and when the language of doctrinal formulations is understood by importing many of the everyday implications of the words, an attempt to evade the symmetry argument can reasonably be ignored. For the diversity of conceptions of the transcendent dooms the alleged core doctrine to vacuity. Gods and spirits, ancestors and mystic forces in sacred places lack enough shared features. Unless we present the least common denominator in explicitly normative terms. The transcendent, we might say, which defies detailed human description, is worthy of special emotional attitudes, of reverence, of awe, perhaps of devotion. So understood, the world's religions can be appreciated as apprehending an aspect of reality, the transcendent, that exceeds any human ability to describe, except in language that is normative, or metaphorical, or allegorical, or poetic. All doctrinal statements are literally false, for that is the way of figures of speech. But literal truth isn't and never was the issue. The crucial point concerns the capacity of metaphors, myths, and stories to orient the lives of the faithful in valuable ways. Pose William James's insistent question and ask if the fruits for life are good. Raising that question across the spectrum of the world's religions and through their historical development might elicit judgments about the progress or backsliding of particular religions. It might assess some religious traditions as superior to others. It might give priority, for example, to those that developed in the so-called axial age. Nonetheless, even if complete symmetry prevailed, that would be no tragedy. But it would simply register an odd quirk of history, the ability of all human cultures to generate equally effective metaphors for coping with a significant but literally indescribable aspect of reality. Now, secular humanism acknowledges the bare possibility of the transcendent, but regards the present assertion of its existence as entirely unwarranted. A religious perspective need not quarrel with that assessment. The assessment of the transcendent and of particular stories and images as gestures toward it may be based on faith. Leaping beyond the evidence is ethically suspect, except when the product of faith is a commitment to the ethical itself. A viable religious perspective, one that can evade the strictures of my secularist argument, can identify the transcendent with the source of virtues, ideals, and duties, of values in the broadest and deepest sense. At the core of religion, then, is not a body of doctrine, descriptions of the transcendent, but a commitment to what James calls the eternal things, external and independent of the believer, indeed of all human beings. The doctrines of the favored religion are then seen as metaphors, stories, apt for conveying the most fundamental values and for guiding the devout towards realizing them. So understood, religion escapes the secularist argument by diverging from some assumptions on which that argument depends. An obvious worry is that success is only achieved through so attenuating the notion of religion that the resultant perspective is no longer worthy of the name. The heart of the religious attitude is faith, understood as a commitment to an objective order of values, a commitment shared among many religious traditions, although perhaps not by those that have failed to take crucial progressive steps. Faith is further articulated as a commitment to particular values, and perhaps to a particular ordering of values. And at that stage, there might be divergence and conflict among different religions. So far, however, nothing distinguishes this religious perspective from ventures in secular philosophy that maintain the existence of objective values and view the world's cultures as advancing different, often incompatible conceptions of the independent ethical order. So, have I saved religion only by collapsing it into realism about values? A religious attitude can distinguish itself from secular acceptance of an independent ethical order in several different ways. First, it adopts a picture of a two-tier universe. Beyond the physical, organic, human realm is a higher level, one in which the grounds of value are located. The worth of human lives and the ethical status of human deeds are measured not by the relations that prevail within the physical, organic, human domain, the lower level, but through their relation to the transcendent, the higher tier. In this spirit, Kierkegaard's claims about the suspension of the ethical can be reinterpreted less literally and more sympathetically by envisaging the possibility that the mundane ethics of human relations is both superseded and deepened by a higher order of ethical life, grounded in the transcendent. Out of this picture comes a first challenge to secular humanism. Can secularists really provide a satisfactory account of values, or do their proposals generate inferior surrogates that diminish the worth of which human lives are capable? A second way of differentiating the religious life from secular commitments to an independent order of values results from embedding the commitment to the transcendent within an array of traditional religious practices. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam can all be developed so as to abandon the literal truth of tales about the transcendent while retaining the ceremonies, rituals, community structures, shared ethical endeavors, and even the creedal professions of their more literalist relations. Sometimes those for whom doctrinal statements are metaphorical through and through may mingle peacefully with their cousins whose declarations make more substantive claims about the transcendent. Other people, inspired by elements of different religions, may integrate parts of disparate traditions in a novel, eclectic synthesis. Yet others, like Emerson, may start explicitly from an abstract notion of the transcendent and consider the design of substitutes for the rites and community structures of neighboring religious life. Distinctive parts of antecedent religious practice are thus preserved, modified, recombined, or refashioned from scratch, always subject to the basic condition that when doctrinal statements are pondered or uttered, they are interpreted figuratively. Once again, the distinction between religious life and the secularist commitment to values presents a challenge for secular humanism. These features of religious life are essential if people are to cope with their mortality and with the potential meaninglessness of their lives. The third difference between the religious attitude and that of the secular believer in an objective order of values follows James in supposing particular types of emotion to pervade the attitude to the transcendent. Acceptance of a higher realm that serves as the source of values is accompanied by solemnity and awe, a humble willingness to subordinate and redirect the impulses of the self, and yet a joyful acquiescence in that discipline. What the Stoic must labor to accept is welcomed gladly. So the religious life unfolds with confidence and hope, seeing the existence of a higher tier of reality as a promise that values can be sought and at least partially achieved. From this approach to distinguishing the religious attitude emerges a third challenge for secular humanism. When human lives are bereft of all these important emotions toward the transcendent, they are diminished, perhaps through the loss of dimensions of experience available to the believer, perhaps through the inadequacy of any purely secular discipline to govern the darker impulses that belong intrinsically to human nature. So I've tried to present a version of religion, which I'm going to call purified religion, that escapes the main argument for secularism. Purified religion, I think, captures major features of the positions defended by those people who characterize the manifestos of contemporary atheists as crude caricatures. On some occasions, champions of purified religion and secular humanists may identify one another as allies. Because both acknowledge the falsehood of substantive doctrines, they're likely to band together against people who insist that religion requires belief in specific claims about the transcendent. whether the insistent are advocates for particular doctrines or whether they're critics who take the end of literal doctrine to be the death of religion. Secular humanists may well admire the appreciation of symmetry among religious traditions, hoping that the consequent resolve to view many of the world's religions as attempting metaphorical evocations of the same transcendent reality is an important step toward ending religious conflict. Finally, since secular humanism is a positive perspective, one concerned with the value of human lives in a thoroughly natural world, it appreciates a focus on the right questions and even the presentation of important challenges. In the end, however, peaceful coexistence must give way to renewed argument. That debate, specifically engagement with the three main challenges that I've just noted, will be the substance of my next 3 lectures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have time for questions. There are a couple of rules, and there are people who resist every year these rules. If you have a question, you have to come to the microphone. This is not because we won't be able to hear you, so don't sit in your seat and say, I can ask from here and make myself heard. We're recording this. That's why you have to come to the microphone. So just please make your way up to either microphone on either side if you have questions you'd like to ask.
Hi, my name is Tom Platt. I have had trouble keeping up with you. Would you explain what you meant by symmetry?
Sure. So what I meant by symmetry here is that the grounds of the beliefs in various different substantive doctrines are all of the same generic type. So if we imagine somebody who is brought up in Australia and in an Aboriginal group and comes to believe in the dream time and its reverberations in the present, and we imagine somebody else who's brought up, say, in a Christian community in the United States, and we look at the processes that stand behind their beliefs, what explains why they come to have the beliefs that they do. In both cases, it's pretty much the same thing. Allegedly, back in the past, there were these special experiences, these special encounters, which were then transmitted to people, and there's a long tradition which has preserved that and that now delivers it to the contemporary believer. That's the simplest way to get out what's symmetrical about this. So the Christian, if transported to the Aboriginal situation, would believe in much the same kind of way in the dream time. Okay, does that help?
Yeah, it's sort of a more refined version of, oh, we all believe in the same God kind of thing, isn't it?
Well, what I came to at the end was an attempt to come to terms with this symmetry argument. So what I wanted to use the symmetry argument for was to cast extreme doubt on the idea that any of these specific substantive doctrines say that there is only one God and this God comes in 3 persons, or the doctrine that there was once a dream time and that this dream time has reverberated throughout the creation in various sacred places. Those are 2 different doctrines about the transcendent. I want to say that the symmetry of the grounds on which those things are believed make us rightly extremely skeptical about those propositions. On the other hand, my version of purified religion attempted to get, as it were, underneath the symmetry and say, look, there's something out there that all of these different religious traditions, with their different stories, their different metaphors, are getting at. And they gesture to it in inadequate ways. So the thought behind purified religion is that we shouldn't take any of these specific doctrines literally. None of them at all. Even the minimal doctrine that there is a single creator of the universe or a mind behind it all. All of that, strictly speaking, is false, and yet there's something out there to which religions as a whole are responding, and which they express in their different individual inadequate ways where they're inadequate for the purposes of description. On the other hand, those ways may be thoroughly adequate and useful for the purposes of guiding the adherents of religion towards appreciating, understanding, and trying to realize the right kinds of values. That's the vision of purified religion that I tried to develop at the end. So the argument came in various bits. I started off by focusing, as atheists typically do, on specific bits of substantive doctrine, and trying to give what I think is the most compelling reason for thinking that all of the substantive doctrines of all of the major world religions, with their importation of ordinary ideas about life and death and so forth, that all of those, strictly speaking, are false. I then said we can get beyond this by understanding the structure of the argument that leads to that conclusion and seeing the places at which assumptions are made, and we can generate out of that a form of religion that escapes the criticism. I called it purified religion. And that's the sort of religion that you just alluded to. It's the idea of this encompassing, pan-human response to something important. But it must be committed through. What I've tried to do is clarify that and see that it must be committed through and through to the idea of specific religious doctrines as being figurative and metaphorical.
Thank you for identifying yourself. That actually reminded me that I didn't tell you the second rule, which is please identify yourself when you ask a question. Thank you for doing that. John?
Hi, my name is John Pitter. Thank you for the very engaging lecture. I was a bit, and obviously you're pressed for time in a lecture like this, but unsatisfied with the initial argument for skepticism, which was a kind of maybe unreliability argument or disagreement argument, and just register two complaints and see if maybe you can address them. The first is it seemed like the method that you pointed to as being unreliable was very coarse-grained, and that it would be much more complicated and maybe the argument would fall apart if it was much more of a fine-grained understanding of the method. For instance, it's not just that of course, most people do follow the face of their community or their parents. Maybe there's religious experience involved, but some traditions may supplement their belief-forming process with a robust natural theology tradition, others may not. Of course, within those that do, there may be very different types of natural theology, some which you may be more friendly to, given the kind of philosophy you do, and some which you may not be friendly to. So there's a lot of fine-grained distinctions there, and once you get fine-grained enough, you might find that, hey, those you no longer have this kind of diversity argument to go with. But the second question is just that this kind of worry is so broad, and it can lead to skepticism so wide-ranging outside of the domain of religion. I do agree that it's worse in religion than in other areas, but just take for one example the belief polarization literature. It says, hey, people come in, they read the same articles in the death penalty, and they leave being more polarized and more extreme in their views. So that's a worrying unreliability claim, which should, I think, reduce our confidence. But the natural response to that is to say, well, let's not form our beliefs in the way that everyone else does. Let's focus on a different kind of method, look to those who we think are particularly epistemically exemplary, and that would just lead to a much more complicated, I think, picture in terms, it seemed like a kind of broad brush, quick dismissal of the transcendent by identifying one real coarse-grained method. Thanks.
Those are very good questions, and they deserve really detailed and elaborated answers. So with respect to the first question, here's the challenge. So you look at all of these, traditions from a very broad brush perspective and say, well, they all do things in much the same way. That's like looking at people forming their beliefs and saying, well, people use their eyes and their memories and they do a bit of thinking. But of course we can make finer distinctions among people's beliefs. Some people think better than others, some people see better than others, some people remember better than others. And so when you look more closely, you can see grounds on which you can actually break the symmetry. And now connecting this with the second part of the challenge, this sort of symmetry argument is sometimes used across factual beliefs with respect to human cultures by people who are sort of fans of cultural relativism, and they say, well, look, you take all this stuff that's given to you by Western science very seriously, but in different cultures they have different views, and if you look at the ways in which views are generated, it's all pretty much the same way. And the right response to that is just the response that you suggested for the religious cases, which is look more closely. Look more closely at the kinds of processes that are going on here. Look at the ways in which different cultures and different groups arrive at their beliefs, and you'll find ways of breaking the symmetry. That's seems to me completely correct. What I want to do, however, is to assert that when you look more closely at the religious case, it actually doesn't get any better. That if you look at the ways in which religions modify and accommodate and change their traditions, the ways in which religious doctrine evolves, you can see that this is pervaded by forms of belief revision that are very unreliable. And that was really the point of my appeal to what I think of as a great Enlightenment tradition that begins about 2 centuries ago with looking at critical studies of religion of very many kinds: anthropological, psychological, sociological, historical, and literary. And it seems to me that those actually do show that the situation with respect to religious belief is not only a bit worse than it is in other domains, but a lot worse. Now, the case of values to which you alluded is, I think, a particularly interesting one and actually quite a troubling one. And that is, so I think I can fight very clearly for a marked difference between the scientific case, say, where I think when one looks more closely, the symmetry can be broken, and the religious case, where when one looks more closely, the symmetry seems to be, if anything, deepened by the closer looking. But the case of values is really hard, and I want to say more about that on Thursday. And maybe your question will come back with renewed vengeance at that point. I want to try to assimilate, actually, the values case more to the scientific case and to cut it off from the religious case. I think that, just to give you a foretaste, I think that we are still struggling to, and this is a very Deweyan point, Dewey thought that something remarkable had happened in the 17th century, that people had then discovered a method that could be used for finding things out about the physical world, about nature, and that the imperative task for philosophy in the early 20th century, and I think you would say in the early 21st century too, was to do the same sort of thing with respect to the human and the moral sciences. I think that's absolutely right. I think we're still struggling towards a method for finding out and reaching consensus on matters of values and breaking the symmetry here. But it's still a work in progress, and I will be talking about that on Thursday. But thank you. Those are excellent questions, and I intend in the written version to say much more about that, as you rightly suggested.